Hello, this is Mike Tatarski, author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, which you can find at vietnamweekly.substack.com. This project is entirely supported by readers and listeners like you, so if you'd like to become a subscriber, please check out the newsletter. I'll include a link in the show notes. And I was really pleased by the feedback to the first episode last week with Michael Brasovsky. That really meant a lot to me and kind of invigorated my feelings about the podcast. And here with the second episode, I interviewed Tu Phuong Nguyen, a lecturer of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute in the University of Melbourne. She's based in Australia and focuses on labor in Vietnam, particularly around social insurance and pension issues. Now, social insurance, I've written about a couple of times in the newsletter. It came up a lot last year due to issues around many workers cashing out their full social insurance fund after losing their jobs, which the government is quite concerned about and is discussing several reforms, some of which Tu calls paradoxical. You'll hear why she thinks that. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was very illuminating. Again, I've covered social insurance, but she's a true expert on the issue. And I think this is an important kind of addendum to the overall story about manufacturing moving here and creating jobs, which is of course good, but there are issues with how these workers are paid, how much they are paid, or how little in many cases, how they are treated, sort of the precarious, a word you'll hear a lot in our conversation, nature of their work can be, even amid overall fast-growing FDI and investment manufacturing growth in Vietnam. So I hope you found this as illuminating as I did, and let's get to my conversation with Tu. Tu, thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and so you focus a lot on labor issues in Vietnam. And I mean, do you want to explain a bit more about your focal points and how you got into this research?
Sure. I have conducted a couple of projects on labor in Vietnam, and I started working on labor issues in Vietnam since about 2014. At that time, I was quite interested in learning about factory workers' working conditions and the way in which the labor law in Vietnam is functioning. So my first project is about workers' engagement with the law and the way in which they perceive the role of the law in helping them to cope with workplace abuses. And the recent project, which I completed in about 2021, is about precarious employment in Vietnam. And in that project, I also focuses on workers' conditions, but the focus is more on social insurance and pension issues.
Okay, great. And I wanted to maybe get a definition. You mentioned precarious, and I've seen in some of your work the phrase precarity. What does that mean in terms of labor?
Yeah. So that term has a lot of definitions, but in the context of my work, and just for the audience to understand a bit more about my work, precariousness in my studies is about the uncertain and vulnerable nature of employment and livelihood. So precariousness is not just a condition experienced by people working in the informal sector,
Mhm.
people working in self-employment, but it is also felt among workers who are employed in a formal sector. And I see that quite clearly in a number of foreign invested companies. We see that with Vietnam's position in the global supply chain, and given the vulnerable condition of the global market in the past few years, employment in the formal sector is quite uncertain, and workers are vulnerable to experiences such as job losses, reduction in working hours, and ultimately reduction in their income.
Okay. And kind of speaking of job losses, I'd like to start with kind of a big picture question, and then we'll focus more on social insurance that you mentioned. But last year, I mean, I suppose every year is eventful when it comes to labor, but here in Vietnam, there were a lot of layoffs, especially at garment and footwear factories, given kind of global economic conditions. So, how would you sort of assess labor as a whole in Vietnam right now? I realize that's a very big question.
I do think that the term precariousness still applies to other sectors, and I know that the garment and the footwear industries are particularly struck hard after COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just with the pandemic, but I think the wave of automation coming to the sectors is also helps explain why the workers are being laid off more often than usual. In the case of uh, emerging what I would say new sectors like the electronic
Mm,
industries, I also see um, precariousness applies here. There have been a couple of reports about workers in electronic industries do not stay long in their jobs, and they tend to switch to informal employment in a couple of years after working in the factories. So I do see that the sense of job stability or job security is not as strong as it used to be.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Again, there's been so many articles about tech manufacturing moving here. So concerning that, that can also be precarious, of course. So moving into social insurance, which you mentioned kind of at the start and you focus on a lot, what is Vietnam's social insurance system?
So the social insurance system in Vietnam is designed to support the employees when they experience loss of income or reduction of their income. And the main benefits of social insurance are pension and maternity benefits. And there are also a couple of other benefits. So under the compulsory scheme, the employers and the employees will contribute a certain amount to employees' social insurance premiums. And that amount will be calculated based on employees' basic wage.
Mm,
All of the employee social insurance premiums are centrally managed by the government, the state. So there's no private social insurance funds in Vietnam as compared to other Western countries.
mhm.
And there are also the voluntary social insurance scheme that is open to people working in the informal sector, but the coverage is quite limited.
So, I mean, you mentioned a big part of it is pension. So I assume that means the funds are kind of meant to be held until a worker retires.
Yes, so if the employees contribute to the social insurance fund for at least 20 years, and when they reach their legal retirement age, they will be entitled to a pension. And currently, the retirement age for men and women in Vietnam are 61 and 56 years old.
Okay. And so, on that note, I mean, last year, again, keeping in mind that this is kind of meant to be a fund that's supposed to sit there for most of your career, last year there was a lot of discussion about people lining up at labor offices, I think kind of around the country, but especially I know here in Ho Chi Minh City, to pull out their entire social insurance fund in one lump sum. I mean, I guess these are people who lost their jobs, maybe in the layoffs we discussed previously. But what was going on, with that, and is that still happening?
I do acknowledge that that is a significant issue. It received a lot of media attention. The rising number of people withdrawing their social insurance early. And I just want to note very briefly that in Vietnam, compared to other countries, it's relatively easy for employees to withdraw their social insurance.
Hmm.
So they can withdraw the fund if they quit their jobs and stop contributing to the fund in 1 year. All right.
Hmm.
Yeah, so compared to other countries, it's relatively easy for employees to withdraw that money. And the trend of early withdrawals has actually increased since about 2010.
Hmm.
If we look at the statistics, where we can see that it started to increase around that period. But following COVID, with many people losing their jobs, they are unable to find employment within 1 year, and they find that withdrawing their social insurance money will help them cope with financial and economic uncertainty. And hence, we see that like the significant rise in number of people queuing in lines, hoping to withdraw their social insurance. I know that it is quite a challenging situation, but if we look at the working and living conditions of many factory workers before COVID. that is not really something shocking, but it is, in my view, a continuation of a trend. Of course, it is becoming more pronounced or profound as a result of COVID, but it's not really something shocking. And I just want to note very briefly some of the statistics. So, for example, from 2016 to 2022, the number of claims for early withdrawal of social insurance increased by about 10% each year. And the rise in the number of people opting out of the social insurance system is challenging to the social insurance system, because it means there will be a lot of pressure on the government and society to provide care and support for people who retire without an income, especially in the context of an aging population.
Kind of a logistical question. If somebody withdraws their social insurance fund and then gets a job later, are they able to start contributing to it again?
Yes, certainly. Employees who withdraw the fund and later, when they get a job, a new employment, and they contribute, yes, they will be able to join, but their contribution, their social insurance contributions, will begin from scratch. So, for example, previously they paid into the fund for 3 years, they withdraw it, and then they rejoin again. Then the previous 3 years won't be counted towards their new contribution. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And you mentioned the challenge kind of structurally that this presents for the government. I mean, I suppose it's a little bit similar to something like social insurance in the US, where, people in their 30s like me might be worried that when they reach retirement, there might not be much money left. So how is the government responding to this, and what sort of, reforms or anything have been discussed?
The government actually started to try to reduce the number of early withdrawals in 2014 and 2015. So at that time, there was a revised law passed that no longer allow employees to withdraw social insurance 1 year after they quit their job. And the law was met with protests from workers. Thousands of workers in a footwear company in Ho Chi Minh City protested against the law, and there was also widespread discontent by workers reported in the south of Vietnam. So the workers' protests prompted the government to hold dialogues with them and to reverse the change in the law, which means that workers are still able to withdraw their social insurance as before. And on the other hand, the government is also increasing the communication campaign in the media through activities of the unions and the local authorities. They are trying to communicate with workers about the benefits of pension, the benefits of continuous contribution to social insurance. And they also talk about the disadvantages that workers would face if they withdraw social insurance early. But it looks like that the campaign hasn't been very effective in stemming or reducing the rise in early withdrawals. And recently, the government is trying to change the law again. The legal reform is actually underway, and the draft law is going to be debated at the next legislative meeting. And if it is passed, it will come into effect in 2025. So this time, the government is having a more cautious approach to changing the law, because they don't want to repeat the mistake that was made in 2014, 2015, right? So there have been a few proposals that are meant to reduce the number of early withdrawals. The most recent ones being considered are the first one is that the employees can withdraw the social insurance premiums early, but they can only obtain up to 50% of their total contributions. And this option is evaluated by the government to offer a balanced approach, right? So if workers need the money in the short term, they can still access the money, but they can only access half of it. and then the rest will remain with the state. So, for example, in the future, workers rejoin the social insurance fund again, they will have something to contribute to, and that will help pay towards their pensions in the future. Another option, but then that first option, that the problem with that first option is that workers may not be very happy with it because it reduces the money that they would think that they will be able to claim. So the second option that the government is considering is that the law will remain the same for existing participants in social insurance, but for new participants, those who join social insurance after 2025, after the new law comes into effect, they won't be able to withdraw social insurance within 1 year after they quit their job. So this option is evaluated as something that would be as being more effective to change the attitude of workers, the mindset of workers, and to reduce the number of social insurance withdrawals in the long term. But in the short term, it may not be very effective because current people who are part of the system, who are currently participating in the system, can still withdraw the money.
It sounds like a really difficult balance to find because these workers who are withdrawing their pension, I'm sure they would rather not do that, but they probably don't have any other financial resources. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So there are different scenarios in which workers would need that lump sum, the social insurance lump sum. The first, and I think the most common reason is job losses, as we've discussed before. The second reason is that workers are caught in financial and economic difficulty, and they think that if they have a large amount of money, then they will help the family, for example, to pay debt, to pay for children's education, to pay for accommodations, etc. So what they do is that they quit their formal employment and then they switch to working casually or working in informal employment. And then 1 year later, they claim the lump sum, which is a huge amount of money that can help them with their family. Yeah, so there are different scenarios in which workers would need to access the money, and usually that is often the last resort for people who are caught in economic and financial difficulties.
And just to try to put a number to some of this, say you're, I see a lot of articles about, women in their late 30s, early 40s kind of being let go at garment factories. Say you're a woman in that age range and you've been contributing to social insurance for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. How much money might be available to them if they were to withdraw it?
It will pretty much depend on their income. Back in 2018, when I had my field work with garment workers, and they share with me their stories and the amount of lump sum that they were able to withdraw. So for typical workers being employed for more than 10 years, they can get a lump sum of 60 to 70 million Vietnam dong, which is worth about a year or so of their usual income. It's just an estimation. Sure.
Yeah. Well, that still helps. I mean, so that's about 2,500 US dollars, well, current dollars, which, it's a significant amount of money for some people. So that's understandable. I mean, you've talked about some of the proposed reforms the government's talking about and some of the issues with them. How do you think they should approach this? Is there, maybe a better way to make sure social insurance is sustainable moving forward?
I think that the reform this time brings us to very an ongoing and persistent challenge of workers' precariousness, and that is a good thing. But I think the way that the government approaches the problem is a bit problematic. I mean, if the problem is about workers' precariousness, then I think the solution would be more to do with supporting them in their income, in their job, and in their livelihood. the options or the proposals that I have mentioned before for this current legal reform, all of these options are paradoxical in a way that the government would want to balance various objectives, balance the objective of reducing social insurance withdrawals and then maintaining social order, which is basically about changing the law without creating social backlash or without upsetting the workers who would benefit from the law. The paradox is that if the legal reform is meant to benefit the workers, then why do they keep opting out of the system? Why do they keep withdrawing the money, right? So because the legal reform process creates so much uncertainty about whether or not in the future workers can or cannot withdraw their social insurance money, there has been news about many workers in garment factories resigning from their jobs so they can withdraw the money before the new law comes into effect. So I think that is the paradox of the legal reform that hasn't been much discussed about in the formal policy discourse. And as I'm back to the issue that I mentioned previously about how the problem should be approached, I think that the proposals being put forth this time are mostly reactive rather than constructive. And I think that more meaningful or constructive measures should be about how to improve workers' livelihood, how to support them better in their job, in their employment, and in their welfare on an everyday basis. And that is particularly crucial for migrant workers who move from the rural to the urban areas to find jobs. They have faced challenges in accessing public services in the destination cities or provinces.
Yeah, so I mean, is that simply because they're from another province and it's difficult to, register and everything, or what is that connected to?
In Vietnam, we have in the past it was called Hộ khẩu or household registration system. So everyone has their own legal residency status registered in their hometown, and the legal residency status will determine your that individual's access to services such as education and public education and public health insurance. So when the workers move to different places, they have to register for temporary residency, and the process could be a bit burdensome. Having said that, they can access the private services in their destination cities or provinces, but the private services are usually much more expensive.
And is it public knowledge how large the social insurance fund is? I'm just kind of wondering, if this trend continues and in a decade or so when, Vietnam is like a lot of countries that has like a reduced birth rates currently. So in the future, there will be more older people than younger people. So if these trends continue, do we know around what year this might turn into a real, crisis is a strong word, but larger problem than it currently is?
It's hard for me to say because those are quite structural macro issues.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's hard for me to say, but certainly thinking about a huge number of people in the future retiring without a pension, that would be a challenge for elderly care, public elderly care. And we in Vietnam, even though we have the norm of filial piety that say that the adult children are expected to take care of their elderly parents, that norm has not been so strongly exercised recently with the new generations beginning to live separately from their parents' families. Yeah, so there will be a lot of pressure in the future to care for people who retire without a pension. And I want to add that the pension benefits that comes with social insurance system also include free public health insurance. So people who don't have the pension means that they have to arrange for the public health insurance for themselves. You may hear people complain that public health insurance doesn't give much benefit, but for those who don't have a lot of money and they will need they might need treatment in public hospitals, public health insurance can actually help to some extent.
Oh, sure. I imagine
Yeah.
it's better than nothing, definitely.
Yeah.
So, also at the start, you mentioned there's sort of a voluntary social insurance fund of some sort for people in the informal sector. I mean, with there's not as much protection, but how does that work?
The voluntary scheme is that people who do not have the formal labor contracts can choose to deduct part of their monthly earnings towards the social insurance fund. So it's basically voluntary, right?
Mm,
And it will really depend on how committed that person can be to contribute
hmm
such a regular amount of money into social insurance fund. And a number of scholars and practitioners working with informal workers shared with me that the rate of participation is really, really low.
I mean, I suppose that's not surprising. I guess if you're
Yeah,
a street food vendor or something, your monthly income is probably not consistent um,
no.
to contribute on a regular basis. Okay, so kind of moving towards a conclusion, you're looking ahead to the rest of this year. You mentioned, I guess, the National Assembly will discuss the potential social insurance reforms, but either related to social insurance or labor more broadly, what are you kind of keeping an eye on for the rest of 2024?
I will certainly keep an eye on for how the final law is passed, what proposal, what option will be decided on. And I think for this year, uncertainty is still something looming in the labor
Mm,
market, especially in the export sectors. Yeah, I just think that the current legal reform process is not going to make a lot of difference to the situation of precarious workers living in precarious conditions. And there's a huge problem of the lack of trust between the workers and the government as well. I mean, as I
mm,
mentioned before, um, if the law is supposed to benefit them, then why do they keep opting out of the system? Why are they trying to run away from it, right? So, ironically, a reform that is meant to help the workers ultimately pushes them away further from the system.
mm.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see what final option will be included in the new law and how workers will respond to that.
Yeah, well, that's definitely something I'll be keeping an eye on as well, and maybe have to talk to you again if something is passed later this year. So, too, thank you so much again. Really interesting topic. Glad you were able to expand on this. I've written about social insurance a couple of times, but I'll admit I don't know a lot about it. So this was really informative. And yeah, thank you again.
Yes, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much, Michael.